Far out in the restless seas of the eastern Indonesian archipelago, a small ring of emerald islands lay scattered around the smoking cone of a restless volcano. These were the Banda Islands, lush volcanic fragments surrounded by deep blue waters, guarded by the jagged teeth of coral reefs and dense walls of jungle. The very air seemed rich with the warm, sweet aroma of nutmeg that drifted from the green groves on the hillsides. For centuries, these islands had been a distant world, known to seafarers of the Malay seas, but far from the struggles of empires. The Bandanese people, Malay-speaking islanders with a strong seafaring tradition, lived in villages of thatched houses perched near the shorelines. Outrigger canoes and elegant war canoes, their prows carved into the shapes of birds and dragons, dotted the bays like patient guardians of the sea. Each village owed allegiance to its own council of elders, the Orang Kaya, the rich men, who were chosen for their wisdom, their wealth, and their skill in guiding the community. There was no single king. Instead, each island was like a small republic, linked to the others by ties of trade, marriage, and custom. Though Islam had come to Banda centuries earlier and shaped the prayers and festivals of the people, their daily lives still carried the rhythm of older traditions. Songs sung in the fields, fishing rituals before the harvest, and stories of ancestors who had crossed the sea in the time before memory. The sea was their highway and their ally. For generations, Bandanese sailors had steered their kora, long, sleek canoes rowed by warriors, to far ports across the archipelago, bringing nutmeg and maize to Malacca, Java, and even the distant markets of China. They knew the monsoon winds like a farmer knows the seasons, and guarded the secret of their island's treasure with pride. At dawn, as the first light washed the volcano's slopes in gold, the villagers would emerge to tend their nutmeg trees, evergreen giants with leathery leaves and fragrant fruit. Children collected fallen husks beneath the trees, while elders sorted the reddish maize from the brown seeds, laying them out to dry in the tropical sun. The island's wealth came from this humble work, and yet the Bandanese themselves had little thought of empires or kings. They traded their spice for cloth, iron and beads, happy to let the great powers of the world remain far away. But that peace could not last. Across the oceans in cities half a world away, merchants and princes dreamed of nutmeg as if it were gold dust. In Europe, a pinch of the spice could flavor a feast or fetch the price of a cow. Doctors prescribed it as a cure for fever and the plague. Aristocrats wore silver nutmeg craters as ornaments. To many in Europe, the Banda Islands were a legend, an enchanted land at the edge of the known world, where a single tree could bring fortune. And so, from the far horizon, sails began to appear. First came the Portuguese, then the English, and then, most determined of all, the Dutch. Each voyage brought strangers, hungering not for the island's beauty or culture, but for the seeds that grew in its soil. The Bandanese were not naive. They had long dealt with foreign traders, Chinese, Malay, Javanese, and Arabs, who came with goods to exchange. When the first Portuguese ship anchored off their coast in the early 16th century, the islanders watched warily. They traded, but never submitted. The strangers were tolerated as long as they came in peace and offered fair prices. The Bandanese viewed themselves as free islanders. Their councils guarded their right to choose their trading partners. A chief might sell a boatload of nutmeg to one captain today and to another tomorrow, favoring whoever brought the finest textiles or the most generous offer. This freedom to trade widely was the foundation of their prosperity. In the evenings, the glow of torches lit the shoreline as fishermen returned with their catch, and elders gathered beneath breadfruit trees to deliberate matters of law and trade. The younger men trained in paddling and the art of the spear, preparing for the raids and rivalries that sometimes flared between villages or against distant neighbors. Yet in all things, their strength lay in their unity as a people of the sea. They could not have known that the next wave of visitors would not be satisfied with peaceful exchange. The Dutch came not merely to buy, but to own. To the merchants of the Dutch East India Company, whose ships plied the seas under the banner of a rising European republic, Banda was not a partner, but a prize. The first Dutch vessels arrived at the turn of the 17th century. Their captains came ashore with smiles and gifts, bearing iron tools, cloth, and silver coins. They struck treaties with some of the Orang Kaya, promising friendship and fair trade. For a time, the Bandanese saw them as one more partner in their bustling network of commerce. But the Dutch were not traders in the old sense. They came with cannons on their ships and muskets in their holds, and they bore the ambition of empire. Behind their polite words lay a plan to seize the nutmeg trade for themselves alone. When the Dutch proposed to build a fortress on Banda Nera, the heart of the archipelago, the chiefs hesitated. A fortress was not a warehouse. It was a claim. To accept it would be to surrender their sovereignty. Tempers rose in the council halls. Rumors spread among the villages. In April of 1609, under the guise of diplomacy, the Bandanese chiefs lured the Dutch admiral Peter Verhoef and his men inland for a parley. In a moment that would burn itself into Dutch memory, the meeting turned into an ambush. Verhoef and dozens of his men were cut down. It was an act of desperate defiance, a declaration that Banda would not be ruled by foreign steel. The Dutch retaliated with burning villages and brutal reprisals. The islanders resisted as best they could, but the Dutch built their fort, and a tense, uneasy peace followed. The Bandanese still dreamed of trading freely with many nations, but the shadow of the fortress on Banda Nera cast a long warning over their shores. The uneasy peace that followed the Dutch fort's construction was like a brittle shell over a restless sea. Beneath the surface, resentment simmered. The Bandanese chiefs resented the way the Dutch demanded exclusive rights to the nutmeg harvest, fixing prices far below the open market. The VOC, the Dutch East India Company, believed in monopoly. But the Bandanese had spent generations trading freely with many partners. The years after the ambush of Admiral Verhoef were marked by sporadic skirmishes. Whenever Dutch ships patrolled the straits, villages fell silent. When they sailed away, smugglers slipped out under the moon to sell their spices to English, Malay, or Javanese merchants. Tensions flared in 1611 when the Dutch returned with a larger fleet under Admiral Piet Hein. They attacked the island of Lontor, punishing villages accused of defying the monopoly. They built another fort and left a garrison behind. But the Bandanese did not yield. They fled into the hills and forests, using the land they knew so well to outmaneuver their enemies. By 1615, the conflict escalated again. A Dutch expedition led by Governor-General Gerard Reinst attacked the island of Ai, attempting to subdue it for the company. The initial assault went well. The Dutch overran the fortifications and celebrated their victory. But discipline faltered. While the soldiers plundered the village, the islanders regrouped and launched a ferocious counterattack. In the chaos, hundreds of Dutch soldiers fell. The survivors retreated in humiliation, their pride as wounded as their ranks. Far from Banda, in distant Europe, another power had been watching events unfold. The English East India Company also sought a foothold in the Spice Islands. Their captains, pragmatic and willing to bargain, found willing partners among the Bandanese chiefs who still dreamed of keeping foreign powers divided. In 1616, the English agent Nathaniel Courthope arrived on the tiny island of Run, one of Banda's outer islets. There he was welcomed by the local leaders, who swore allegiance to King James I in exchange for a promise. The English would buy their spices at better prices and protect them from Dutch aggression. Courthope fortified the island, turning Run into a lonely outpost of English influence. For 5 years, he and a small garrison held their ground, enduring sieges, hunger, and constant Dutch harassment. The Bandanese saw in him a chance to resist the VOC's monopoly, and for a time the alliance held. But the Dutch were relentless. In 1619, after a long and bitter siege, Courthope was killed in a skirmish, and the English garrison, exhausted and outnumbered, abandoned the island. Dutch troops swarmed over Run. In a display meant to crush further resistance, they executed most of the surviving men and uprooted or burned every nutmeg tree so that the island would be worthless to anyone else. The fall of Run marked a turning point. That same year, Jan Pieter Zoon Cohen became Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies. A man of sharp intellect and iron will, Cohen was driven by the conviction that the Dutch were destined to dominate the spice trade. Cohen had little patience for compromise. He saw the Bandanese chiefs not as partners, but as obstacles, rebellious subjects who had to be subdued. To him, the open trade that the Bandanese cherished was disorder. Order meant a monopoly enforced by Dutch guns. Though the Dutch and English signed treaties in Europe to share access to the spice trade, Cohen seethed at what he saw as weakness. He considered any concession to the English or the Bandanese a betrayal of Dutch ambition. In private letters, he argued that the only way to secure Banda was to break its people's resistance completely and to repopulate the islands with more compliant settlers. By 1620, Cohen had decided that enough was enough. Banda would never be truly secure until it was conquered outright. The memory of Verhoef's murder and years of defiance gnawed at Dutch pride. The Governor-General began to prepare the largest expedition the company had yet launched in the Spice Islands. As the year 1621 dawned, the Dutch fleet assembled. Warships gathered in the harbors of Ambon and Batavia, their hulls laden with soldiers, gunpowder, and iron cannon. Among the ranks were not only Dutch soldiers, but also Japanese mercenaries, renowned for their discipline and deadly skilled with the blade. Cohen himself commanded the expedition, his presence lending it the campaign authority. He saw it as more than a conquest. To him, it was the will of God made manifest through Dutch arms. The Bandanese, scattered across their islands, watched the horizon with growing dread. They had resisted foreign powers for generations, but now an armada loomed larger than any they had seen before. War canoes were readied, weapons sharpened, and families quietly prepared to flee into the jungles if the worst should come. By February, the Dutch fleet anchored off Banda Islands, the heart of the archipelago. The air hung heavy with the smell of sea salt and volcanic ash as soldiers disembarked, setting up camps near the old fortress. The sound of drums echoed across the water, a grim herald of what was to come. When the Dutch armada finally moved against Lonto, the largest island in the Banda chain, the sea was as still as molten glass. Canoes manned by Bandanese scouts kept watch along the reefs, their paddlers tense as they glimpsed the great ships drawing nearer. The sight of so many tall-masted vessels crowding the horizon was like nothing the islanders had ever seen, an ominous wall of sails and timber advancing on their quiet shores. From the heights above the beaches, women and children watched in silence. The morning mist clung to the green slopes of the hills, and in the distance, the volcano's summit sent a faint ribbon of smoke into the sky. Below, Dutch boats pushed toward the shallows, soldiers crouched low within them as the boatsmen rowed. The first attempt to land was repelled. As the soldiers waded through the surf, arrows and musket shots rained down from the tree line. A cheer rose from the islanders when the invaders faltered and withdrew to their ships. That day the defenders celebrated quietly, their warriors standing proudly with spears planted in the sand. But they knew the Dutch would return. The Dutch regrouped quickly. Within days, they launched a coordinated assault from several beaches. Cannon fire shook the earth, smashing palisades and sending splinters into the air. Bands of Bandanese fighters met them at the shore, but were driven back by the sheer weight of numbers and firepower. By the end of March, the Dutch controlled the lowlands and most of the villages near the coast. The Bandanese withdrew into the steep interior, where dense jungle and sharp ridges offered natural defenses. Cohen, believing he had broken the backbone of resistance, sent envoys under flags of truce. The chiefs of Lonto, weary and fearing for their families, came down to the Dutch camp. They brought gifts of cattle, fruit, and baskets of nutmeg. They offered their loyalty to the company in exchange for safety. Cohen met them with solemn courtesy. He promised freedom of worship and protection for their people, so long as they surrendered their weapons and agreed to sell their spices to the company alone. The chiefs, believing they had no better choice, accepted. For a brief time, there was quiet. Women ventured out from hiding to collect food. Fishermen paddled their canoes once more, and the smoke of cooking fires rose gently from the huts. Yet in the hearts of both sides, suspicion smoldered. The Bandanese distrusted the Dutch promises. Cohen, for his part, saw the islanders not as new subjects, but as obstacles that had yet to be removed. In the weeks that followed, rumors reached Cohen that some chiefs were secretly contacting allies on other islands and urging rebellion. Bands of warriors were said to be gathering in the hills. The Governor-General, already convinced that the Bandanese would never truly submit, seized upon these whispers as proof of treachery. He ordered the arrest of several leading chiefs. Under harsh interrogation, they were accused of plotting a revolt. Whether the confessions were true or wrung from them by pain mattered little to Cohen. He believed that only terror would secure the Dutch hold on the islands. On a humid May morning, the chiefs were brought to the square, before the Dutch fort. Bound at the wrists, they stood in silence as Cohen's soldiers read the charges. A crowd of islanders gathered at a distance, many holding their children close, others clinging to hope that mercy might yet be shown. No mercy came. At Cohen's command, Japanese mercenaries drew their swords. One by one, the chiefs were forced to kneel. Blades flashed in the sunlight, and the sand grew dark beneath their feet. The heads of the executed were set on stakes around the fort, a grisly warning to all who would defy the new order. The executions were only the beginning. Cohen unleashed his army across the hills of Lontor. Villages were torched, their flames painting the night sky red. Nutmeg groves were cut down or claimed for the company. The old songs and rituals that had once bound the people together were drowned out by the crack of muskets and the screams of the hunted. Families fled higher into the forested slopes, carrying only what they could hold. Mothers tried to quiet their children as they hid among the rocks, hoping the soldiers would pass them by. Hunger and thirst became their new enemies, and disease followed closely behind. Some warriors fought on, launching daring ambushes against patrols before melting back into the jungle. But as the days stretched into weeks, their resistance faltered. Exhaustion and despair spread through the camps of the displaced. By the end of the campaign, the hills of Lontor were strewn with the remains of the fallen. The once thriving villages stood empty, their gardens overgrown and their houses in ruins. The green, fragrant heart of Banda had been broken. When the smoke finally cleared, the Dutch stood unchallenged. Lontor was a land of ghosts. The proud communities that had once tended its nutmeg trees and sailed its waters were gone. Only a handful of islanders survived, most of them women and children taken as captives. Those who resisted had been slain, starved, or scattered. The survivors were enslaved or exiled to distant islands. The orchards that had once sustained the Bandanese were parceled out to Dutch planters. Cohen declared the campaign a success. The company had won the monopoly it craved, yet the cost was staggering. A people erased, a culture uprooted, an island transformed from a place of vibrant life into a plantation of silence and sorrow. The winds that swept across the nutmeg grove still carried the same sweet scent as before. But to those who remembered, it was forever mingled with the bitterness of loss. In the weeks after the slaughter, the once lively harbors of Banda lay eerily quiet. Canoes that had once crowded the beaches lay overturned or shattered, their paddles broken and left to bleach in the sun. The air still carried the faint scent of charred wood from burned villages. The Dutch soldiers, weary from months of campaign, now turned their attention to rebuilding what they had destroyed. But not for the Bandanese. The land was surveyed and divided into plots called birkin, neat rectangular plantations carved from the slopes where nutmeg trees still grew in stubborn clusters. The remaining Bandanese were too few to work the land. Most were in chains, taken aboard ships to Batavia or Ambon as slaves. Others had vanished into the wild hills or fled to neighboring islands, their fates unknown. For the Dutch, this emptied land was a blank slate. They brought in slaves and indentured laborers from Java, Sulawesi, and India to cultivate the spice groves. These new workers toiled under harsh discipline, their sweat feeding the company's profits. The old songs of Banda's people were gone, replaced by the clipped orders of overseers and the creak of wooden presses drying nutmeg in the sun. Jan Peter Cohen returned to Batavia as a man celebrated by his superiors. The victory at Banda, they declared, had secured the Dutch monopoly over nutmeg and maize, two of the world's most coveted spices. Ships sailed for Amsterdam laden with the fragrant seeds, their value rivaling silver and gold. In the markets of Europe, nutmeg's price remained high, ensuring enormous profits for the VOC's investors. Merchants toasted Cohen's success, seeing in the conquest of Banda a model for Dutch dominion across the East Indies. Yet even among his own countrymen, there were murmurs of unease. Some traders and ministers questioned the morality of annihilating an entire people to control a trade. Reports from the islands, whispers of heads on stakes and villages burned, troubled a few consciences, though they were often drowned out by the clink of coin in the counting houses. Cohen himself was unrepentant. In letters and speeches, he justified the massacre as necessary for the security of the company and the prosperity of the Dutch Republic. To him, the Bandanese had chosen their fate by resisting. In Banda, however, the cost of this security was etched into every hillside and hollow valley. Where laughter and bargaining once filled the marketplaces, there was only the rustle of palm leaves and the rhythmic thud of plantation tools. Despite the devastation, the Bandanese were not entirely gone. Some families who had fled to neighboring islands, Ke, Aru, and Seram, kept alive fragments of their traditions. They spoke in hushed tones of the green hills of Banda, of orchards lost and ancestors slain. A few were eventually brought back by the Dutch to serve as laborers in their former homeland, reduced to tenants in the land of their ancestors. Their language and customs endured in small enclaves, carried like embers through generations. For these survivors, the sight of the old nutmeg trees was a bitter reminder of what had been taken. Every harvest was a reminder that the wealth of the land now flowed to strangers. Centuries later, when historians pieced together the events of 1621, the magnitude of the tragedy emerged in full. It was not merely a battle lost, but a society uprooted, a culture nearly erased for the sake of profit. Today, the Banda Islands are quiet once more, their green slopes dotted with nutmeg trees, as in centuries past. The harbors welcome visitors who come to see the remnants of old forts and to walk the orchards where so much blood was once shed. In remembering Banda, one confronts not merely an episode of colonial expansion, but the enduring truth that conquest leaves scars deeper than any battlefield. The groves still bloom, the harbor still welcomes the tide, but beneath that beauty lies the story of a people who once called the islands their own. If you found this exploration of the Banda Massacre insightful, please consider supporting our work. Like this video to help it reach more history enthusiasts, and subscribe for more in-depth journeys into the past. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Share your perspective in the comments below. Together, let's keep history alive and accessible for everyone.